Hello and welcome back to my channel. This is another really random sporadic video because right now my presence on BookTube is quite sporadic and sparse and not very frequent. So I'll give what I can give and you guys take what you can get from this arrangement that we have. My intention at the beginning of the year was not to film at all. In the middle, I was like, maybe BookTube is not for me. And then when I moved, I was like, I do miss making videos, and more than making videos, I miss the conversations around books. So, I moved in September. Today is January the 1st, so it's only been 3 months, and it took me some time to get my bearings right. Work-wise, family-wise, moving to a new place-wise, figuring out directions and navigation, like literally and metaphorically as well. But I have not been posting very active reviews on Goodreads, and the way that I kind of like review books is just on Instagram, where I basically post a picture of the book, the star rating, and then like a 2-line review, and that's been working so far. But I did read some great books this year and I just wanted to talk about them. So I'm sorry I'm constantly looking outside, but we live right next to a train station, and I feel like every time the train goes, you can obviously hear it, but it catches my eye, so I'll try not to do that. But yeah, so this year I read 30 books. I finished the 30th book yesterday and I ended up giving it 5 stars, not because it was the last book of the year, but it just was that good. And I believe earlier in the book I was reading more fiction, and then when I moved I started reading a lot of nonfiction, which I genuinely love. So I made a list of books that kind of stood out from the 30 books I read. So I made some notes. They're not very detailed, it's literally just like 2 pages, and on this list I have 7 books, 5 of which are nonfiction and 2 of which are fiction. And I'm doing this in the order that I finished them, like starting from December and going backwards, because it's just I want to talk about the recent ones first because I just remember them better. So anyhow, I'm gonna get more comfortable and start talking about the books. The first book that I will talk about is called I'm Glad My Mom Died by Jeanette McCurdy. Jeanette McCurdy is a former Nickelodeon star. She was in 2 Nickelodeon shows, children's shows. One of them was called iCarly and the other one was called Sam and Cat, which was a spin-off from iCarly. I've been following Nickelodeon shows when I was a kid. I think when I was growing up, Drake and Josh was the most popular one. And then I followed like The Sweet Life of Zack and Cody, and iCarly and Sam and Cat came up after that, but like I feel like I would still watch them even though it was not directed towards my demographic, but I just really enjoyed watching them. So I kind of knew of Jeanette McCurdy's face without knowing her name because I've seen like random episodes of Sam and Cat. And then when this book came out, like it was just on every bestseller, and I didn't want to like read a book about like a celebrity that I didn't really know or care about. But then when I started reading the reviews, I was like, wait, this might actually be quite interesting. And I was extremely surprised by how easy this book was to read, even though it talks about very, very difficult issues. This book is basically about Jeanette McCurdy's toxic, abusive relationship that she had with her mother growing up. She was pushed into acting at the age of 6 years old, and she later on, like at a younger age, had an awareness that she doesn't really want to act. This is not something that she really enjoys, but it was her mom's decisions to kind of like keep putting her up for auditions and in shows so that she can earn money to help the mom. And the mom was basically very manipulative, very controlling, and I feel like reading some of the stuff was really hard because you can clearly tell that this grown woman is manipulating a young child emotionally and later on physically in a way that Jeanette McCurdy was introduced to calorie restriction and dieting and extremely anorexic behaviors from the age of 11, which was encouraged by her mom because she wanted to keep her daughter's body small so that she can continue to act in like children's shows and continue to be cast as a child actor. And then after her death, like after her mom died of cancer, Jeanette McCurdy continued to struggle with her body image, her bulimia, her mental health was not great. And this book is basically just about her journey as a young child star. She has now given up acting. That makes me really happy because I feel like you have to kind of put a stop. And the whole idea of this book is that your family can be pretty toxic and you have to distance yourself from them because families are kind of introduced as, especially moms, as such like close units, and you can't really say anything about moms because they're kind of put on a pedestal. Like, I have a great relationship with my mom, so this is not coming from a personal experience, but the fact that like one should recognize that people in your family can be extremely toxic, and you should do whatever you can to preserve your mental health and your well-being. And another reason that I really like this book was that I love it when you can see who an actor is, like behind what they present on TV. Like really getting an insight into who they are as a person. So I gave this book 5 stars. I really enjoyed it. I bought a copy for myself, and I wasn't sure if this would be one worth keeping, but I feel like it's definitely one worth keeping on my shelf because it's kind of a story of not just like I've recovered, I'm fully well now. It's a story of continuous recovery, and I really enjoyed it. So 5 out of 5 stars. The next book that I have is called A Curious History of Sex by Kate Lister. I also gave this book 5 stars. This is a big book, and I feel like the last 100 pages are notes and references. And that's like this big chunk is just notes and references. And I love it when a nonfiction does that because then you know how carefully researched and how well thought out it is. So this is basically a book, I'll refer to my notes here. It's basically a book where myths related to sexual practices originated from, like some of the old wives' tales that we hear growing up. Like in ancient times, people used to do this, and it kind of breaks them down. It also talks about like myths about female bodies and male bodies and what should be believed and what were some of the ancient practices that were continuing. Like there was a thing that priests had way back in the day that men should not release their sperms, or men should not ejaculate because it's going to, you know, like cause disease. And there was another part about how women should wash their private parts with drain cleaners such as Lysol because it won't, like, it will stop the spread of infections. And that was like really different to read, but at the same time, like, women's bodies have been through so much, and so many experiments and myths have been believed about them. There's a whole chapter about menstruations and what happens in different parts of the world, or what were the different practices that women were subjected to. In some cultures it was extremely celebrated to the point that there was an ancient king who used to drink period blood because it thought that it had like miraculous healing properties. And in other parts of the world, like, the women would be put in huts outside of their home because they thought that they were unclean. There's a whole section about male and female prostitution, how it originated, with where it comes from, and how like it's basically the medieval European colonizers who put such a stigma around sex work. So she deals with it in a very compassionate way, and I really like that. Additionally, this book gives you a lot of information, but it's super accessible. It's very easy to read, even though the topics are fairly complicated, and all of this done with like a sarcastic and a healthy dose of humor, and I really enjoyed it. So I initially got the audiobook for it, which I connected to our car so I can listen to it, you know, when I'm in the car and my husband can just, you know, hang out. But very soon he took over my audiobook, and I realized that he was listening to it very actively, so I left the audiobook to him and then I read it in physical form. The next book that I'm going to talk about is called Not All Superheroes. This was a book that I borrowed from the library, and I really enjoyed it. This is also nonfiction, and it basically talks about superheroes and their rise to, like, you know, this superior level of popularity over the years. But it also talks about how women are generally treated in these superhero comic books, and it was also a really interesting read. I don't know what I'm doing with my hand. It basically talks about how women were introduced into superhero comics as side characters. They didn't really have much of a role to play with. They were pretty brainless. They were always in trouble, damsels in distress who needed a lot of rescuing from their like male counterparts. And, you know, Superman comes in and sweeps in and rescues the woman, and the woman has nothing to do in the comic other than just like drive the plot along and be like eye candy or an accessory to look at. And it kind of talks about like the sexualization of women throughout like the history of comic books, and how basically Marvel would have certain characters and DC would have like other characters. And there was also a conflict between like the writers and the people who, the artists who draw it, that, you know, the artist would kind of like want to give women like more to do, more to say, but the person writing the comic, the writing and the dialogue, would just dumb them down and not really have like for them to do anything. And then there was a commentary, like constant commentary about how women were dressed, like how these female characters were dressed in these comic books, extremely skimpy clothes, almost wearing nothing, because the target demographic for these books would be young boys, so women would just, you know, be there to catch their interest. But there's also like darker trends in this, that other than furthering the plot, like women have been subjected to a lot of violence throughout the years in these comic books. They have been murdered brutally, like raped, assassinated, killed, and just to further the story along, but also in a lot of like very, very gruesome detail. And it's just that, like, why are they used like that? Like, why is it so acceptable to write about like the violence that women get to experience on the page? And this is something that really the male audience enjoyed. There's also a lot of commentary on how female fans of comic books are treated, because there's a perception that the superheroes are only for boys and men, and if there's a woman who seems to be like interested in it, they also are treated with a lot of misogyny and just a lot of sexism towards them. Like, they're called fake fans, and like the geek girls are not really real fans because they don't really know. And yeah, so it's just like it's acceptable when the women are on the page and they're not really wearing any, you know, a lot of like clothing. The clothing's very revealing, but at the same time, if these same women dressed up as the characters, they would automatically be termed as very slutty. It was a really, really good read. I really enjoyed it, and 5 stars. Next book that I'm going to talk about is called Unreconciled by Jesse Wente. Jesse Wente is basically a Canadian journalist. He is Indigenous and he is a very famous media personality, and this book is his memoir. And this was a really interesting one because I'm a new immigrant to Canada, and I know of some Indigenous history in the last few years, not even history, like just pieces of news that I would hear, especially about residential schools and things like that. The land acknowledgement is something that I learned in Canada, that at my workplace, before you start any important meeting, you have to acknowledge the land, which is you have to kind of acknowledge who the people, which were the tribes who lived in that area before it was colonized. So the area that I live in, which is Toronto, is basically covered by Treaty 13 and the ancient tribe of the Mississaugas of the Credit who used to live here. So I really wanted to learn more about Indigenous people, and this was the perfect book to start with. So as an Indigenous person, Jesse Wente explains all the racism and the microaggressions. So he basically talks about family history. He talks about how his grandmother went to a residential school, how she was treated there, and how like people, when they were in the residential schools, they didn't really think that anything bad was happening to them, in the way that all colonizers thought that they were just benefiting the people who were there, and the people kind of like accepted it with a lot of like, maybe not very openly, but they just didn't have any choice, because the colonizers, what they end up doing is just taking over and dictating the way that life should be lived. So this was a really interesting one because he kind of gives an analysis of like how there are so many like media outlets which promote racism, and especially how movies are extremely racist towards Indigenous people, because he also worked as a movie critic. One of the most striking things was the Avatar, the movie. Like, there was a very interesting commentary on this Avatar movie, the first part, that it was extremely racist to Indigenous people, and it was, you know, kind of whitewashing their history. There was a lot of erasure in that, and I found that like super interesting because the second part came out. Like, I haven't seen the first one, but the second one is like all over cinemas here, and we're kind of wondering like, do we want to watch that? And I was like, I actively don't want to watch that because I read like critique of the first part, and I don't want to like watch the first movie so that I can watch the second one. But overall, I learned a lot from this book about like Indigenous history, and how basically even the Canadian government, which is Justin Trudeau's government, made a lot of promises, but there hasn't been a lot of follow through or follow up to those promises to the Indigenous people, because their rights continue to be violated, that their land continues to be taken, and the women and girls especially are at risk of being kidnapped and murdered. It was very informative. 5 out of 5 stars. Really enjoyed it. The next book I'm going to talk about is called My Body by Emily Ratajkowski. Emily Ratajkowski is also a celebrity who I did not know before until her book came out, and I just didn't really care about that. But then this was also one of those books that really surprised me, and I was surprised by how much I liked it. So Emily is basically like a really pretty model. She has been in a bunch of movies, and one of her more famous appearances is in a song called Blurred Lines by Robin Thicke, I believe. And the song was quite controversial enough to begin with because it was called Blurred Lines, which kind of implies blurring lines of consent. And Emily basically was groped on the set by the main singer, and she never spoke about it until this book. And it basically kind of like talks about her experiences living in her body, how she lives in this world where her body is kind of like a commodity to other people. She talks about experiences of being violated in different ways, in different times, in different situations, how there were pictures taken of her which were printed like multiple times without her consent, and she had no control over that, and all of the experience she had living in her body. Yeah, so I definitely enjoyed it. It was fairly well written. It was very easy to read. It was very engaging. I believed I finished it in two sittings, which is very rare for me because I'm someone who takes 10 days to finish a book. So yeah, overall really enjoyed it, really liked it. I believe I gave it 4 stars because it was not quite 5 stars, but definitely one of the more enjoyable ones that I read over the year. And the last 2 books that I want to talk about are basically fiction books. So far everything that I've discussed is non-fiction, but there are 2 fiction books which really stand out to me. The first one is called The Service. I'm just looking at my laptop. This one is written by Frankie Mirren, and I read it as an ebook, and it basically talks about sex work in a fictional UK where sex workers are kind of, not allowed to function online anymore. So it's about 2 sex workers who are trying to make ends meet. They live in completely different circumstances. One of them is an older woman who has a child. The other one is kind of like a fairly young university student. And the third woman is basically a journalist who is trying to put a stop to their careers. And I really enjoyed it because it was just a different kind of a book, because I feel like so far if you've thought of like sex work in black and white terms, this book will completely change that perspective and give you like a different shift, because it kind of is a gray area that we don't really know what conditions they work in or under what circumstances they need to work in that profession. So it definitely was an interesting read because it was very eye-opening with a lot of information about their rights and the rights of sex workers, and how there are days designated to commemorate the rights of sex workers. It also talks about like abusive behavior, stalkerish behavior from men, and generally from that perspective too, and how men and the society generally use sex work as well. I really enjoyed it. And the last book that I'm going to talk about is called Minor Detail by Adania Shibli. This is basically a book about Palestine and the Palestinian cause. So it basically is set in 2 timelines. The first one is during the Nakba in 1949, when the Israeli military occupies Palestine and the Palestinians are thrown out and the Israelis take over. And in this time, there is one Palestinian woman who is basically captured by the Israeli soldiers, and basically she has a very difficult, as one would imagine, like a very difficult fate in front of her because she has basically been captured. And the other part of the book is basically about a younger woman who discovers the story of the first woman 25 years later, and she is extremely curious about it, and she wants to know what became of the first woman at that time. So she starts to do her own research, and then the 2 kind of like narratives entwine. And it's a really short book. Like it's 100 pages, maybe 120, but it took me a week to read it because it's a difficult subject, and it's also very heavy that you kind of feel the emotion on the page. So let me read out exactly what I wrote about it. In both these scenarios, the reader is with the unnamed characters and goes through the events with them. It is an uncomfortable place to be, as we are forced to face the horrifying calamities of war, ethnic cleansing, and living under occupation. The author showcases the anxiety of the second narrator really well, and the reader really feels suffocated in her skin. Living under constant scrutiny, one fears the narrator as she is not able to move freely and constantly finds herself places where she's not supposed to be. Because Palestinians are basically like contained to one area and they're not allowed to move freely. They need special passes if they need to go from one place to the other. I also found that the writing in this book is very sparse, but it also works because the imagery is very vivid. Like you can imagine the barking dogs, and you can imagine the smell of gasoline, and you can imagine like all these little sounds and feelings, and like the birds flying in the sky. You can like really feel that, and I gave this book 5 star because it was just an incredible read in my opinion, and I definitely would love to own a copy of it. I haven't bothered looking for it yet, to be honest, but I think this is one that that I would love to have a copy of. This is kind of random, but I now have like one small Billy bookcase that we got from IKEA, thinking that, you know, I'm not going to buy a lot of books here. But over the past week, I've been off and I've been going to bookstores every day so that I can just hang out, but I end up getting books for myself. That my IKEA bookshelf might soon have a brother or a sister coming in. So yeah, but those are the books that I read. Those are the 7 books that I really enjoyed out of the 30 that I read. So anyhow, let me know if you've read any of these books, or if you would like to read any of these books, or if there are any books that you would like to recommend based on the books that I enjoyed. Anything that you want to say, I would really love to hear back. But thank you so much for watching, and hopefully I'll see you guys soon. Bye.